Immediately opening a diagonal for the queen and bishop, d4 establishes central influence and sets the stage for rapid development. Developing a knight to its most active square, nf6 immediately contests the center and prepares for queenside expansion. Establishing central presence, this c4 pawn aggressively contests space and prepares to unleash queenside pressure against your knight. Challenging white's center immediately, creating immediate structural tension. Pawns advance, stealing crucial central squares and initiating a positional squeeze. Opening the e-file offers immediate counterplay against white's pawn center, aiming to free black's game. Bolstering central influence, this knight prepares to occupy a key square and dominate the d5 pawn. Opening the center this way invites immediate tactical skirmishes and a race for piece activity. Unlocking the queen's diagonal here immediately forces black's hand, aiming to seize initiative and potential attacking lines. Reclaiming central space solidifies black's pawn structure and prepares to contest the d-file. Developing the knight here unblocks the bishop on c1 and pressures the center, a natural step to solidify white's central presence. Unlocking the bishop's diagonal towards white's queenside presents a dynamic counterplay opportunity, though it concedes the central e5 square for the moment. Boldly staking claim in the center, this thrust immediately challenges black's fianchettoed bishop and prepares to open lines for future aggression. Opening up the kingside diagonal for your bishop is a crucial step, creating immediate pressure against white's central pawn structure. This bishop now eyes potential weaknesses and prepares for future queenside expansion, harmonizing with your knight's development. Anchoring the knight with pressure, this developing thrust aims to pin the crucial defender and immediately create tension, potentially disrupting black's intended kingside expansion. Confronting the bishop on g5, this pawn push instantly challenges the advanced structure and probes white's intentions on the kingside. Recapturing on f4 maintains the bishop's influence on the long diagonal, indirectly pressuring black's kingside structure and preparing for potential kingside action without compromising white's central pawn mass. Aggressively challenging the knight's outpost with g5 sacrifices pawn structure, exposing the king's immediate vicinity to potential tactical storms, and creating an uneven battlefield where piece activity will likely dictate the outcome over positional solidity. Retreating the bishop to its starting square after black's aggressive pawn push on g5 feels like a strategic reevaluation, sacrificing tempo to maintain piece integrity. White is prioritizing the development of other pieces, perhaps aiming to consolidate the center before committing the bishop to a potentially exposed diagonal. This repositioning also frees up the c1 square for a queen or rook in later stages, hinting at a long-term positional game rather than immediate tactical skirmishes. Securing the king's safety is paramount, and casting on this flank efficiently tucks him away from the central fray that has been developing, simultaneously preparing to activate the rook along the newly opened file. Initiating a knight's repositioning to d2 aims to both solidify the central pawn structure and prepare for a potential kingside assault, subtly eyeing the f3 square for future maneuverability. A strategic repositioning is underway, aiming to free the queen's knight from its passive guard of the d6 pawn and prepare for a more active role on the kingside or central squares, potentially supporting e5 advance or reinforcing the queenside if the game takes that turn. The bishop retreats to a seemingly passive square, but it's a shrewd maneuver, reinforcing the central pawns and preparing to redeploy to the kingside should the opportunity arise. White seeks to consolidate after black's aggressive pawn push, aiming to control the d5 outpost and slowly build pressure. This quiet development subtly shifts the focus from direct confrontation to strategic maneuvering, hinting at a long-term positional struggle rather than an immediate tactical slugfest. Observe how the pieces begin to harmonize, creating a cohesive structure ready to exploit any weaknesses in black's slightly overextended position. The knight repositions to a more dynamic outpost on e5, threatening to disrupt white's central pawn structure and potentially targeting weaknesses around the white king's defense on the kingside. Shifting the knight to f1 aims to reroute it, potentially to g3, to defend the kingside and prepare for a kingside pawn storm, while simultaneously clearing the way for the f-pawn to advance. Black boldly challenges white's queenside structure, aiming to expand their own influence and potentially disrupt white's pawn chain before white can solidify it. Sacrificing a bishop for pawns, white initiates a sharp tactical sequence, disrupting black's queenside expansion and aiming to open lines towards the enemy king. A bold choice that demands precise follow-up to exploit the resulting material imbalance and positional advantages. Unleashing the queen to threaten the isolated pawn on a2, this maneuver seeks to immediately exploit white's slightly compromised queenside structure after the capture of the d5 pawn. Black aims to disrupt white's development and potentially create imbalances, forcing white to defend reactively rather than continue with their central expansion. The king's safety isn't the immediate concern here, but rather the tactical exploitation of a material imbalance and positional weaknesses. Unleashing a knight toward the kingside, white aims to exploit the newly created space on g3, eyeing potential attacking squares and reinforcing the central pawns. Black aggressively pushes forward, aiming to dislodge white's advanced pawn and gain queenside space, though this might overextend black's pawn structure and invite complications on the now weakened queenside. Fortifying the king's sanctuary before embarking on deeper ventures demonstrates a pragmatic approach, prioritizing safety amidst the encroaching pawn's storm on the queenside. Sensing the pressure building on the queenside, black repositions the rook, intending to contest the open b-file and perhaps eye a potential pawn sacrifice to disrupt white's central control. Challenging black's initiative, white's queen boldly occupies the open diagonal, aiming to disrupt the coordination of black's pieces and potentially exploit the now undefended c4 pawn. Embracing the exchange, black relinquishes the initiative in the center, a bold decision that opens lines for white's pieces while attempting to simplify and potentially outplay in a less complex structure. This maneuver strategically trades off a queen that was quite active on the queenside, suggesting a desire to avoid immediate tactical complications and perhaps target a slight weakness created by white's advanced pawns, even if it means a slightly cramped position for black's rooks. White claims the isolated pawn on c4, a significant material gain that forces black into a defensive posture, aiming to neutralize the imbalance. The immediate attack on white's central pawn with the knight injects a fascinating tactical charge, potentially disrupting white's comfortable pawn structure and opening up avenues for counterplay. Retreating the bishop to b5 solidifies the queenside pawn structure by reinforcing the b4 square, preventing black's knight from finding a comfortable outpost there, and limiting the influence of black's rook on the b-file. Unleashing the knight to g4 injects a dynamic element, aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure and exploit the potential weakness around the king once the bishops are exchanged. Consolidating the knight's position allows for a potential redistribution of forces, aiming to exploit the structural weaknesses black has created by advancing pawns on the queenside, potentially preparing to reroute the knight towards the center or even a kingside assault once the pawn chain stabilizes. The doubled pawns on c4 and c7, a consequence of that earlier queen sacrifice, now present a significant structural weakness for black, making the capture of the knight a strategically sound, albeit positionally risky maneuver. Reclaiming the open file with the rook after a tense exchange, white aims to immediately contest the d-file and prevent black from consolidating their material advantage. This redeployment is crucial for opening up white's queenside and initiating counterplay, as the knights are currently awkwardly placed and need support to become active. The goal is to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure and create targets before the opponent can finish their development. This knight's repositioning to e5 immediately challenges white's central pawn structure and eyes the weak f3 square, hinting at potential kingside pressure if white isn't careful with their king's safety. Securing the queenside with a pawn shield, white aims to restrict black's powerful bishop and prevent immediate queenside expansion, though this creates a slight weakness on the light squares around the king. Black seizes the open file, immediately creating a dynamic tension that will demand white's full attention as the rook now aggressively targets the d3 pawn. Opening the A file with this capture immediately reclaims a pawn and establishes pressure along the now open column, aiming to exploit black's somewhat exposed king position and potentially target weaknesses on the queen side. Asserting control over the queen side, by solidifying the pawn structure and challenging white's bishop pair represents a vital defensive maneuver. The bishop retreats, preserving its presence on the queen side while subtly surveying the territory ahead. This repositioning serves a dual purpose. Firstly, it keeps the bishop on the long diagonal, a powerful line for it to exert pressure. And secondly, it avoids any immediate tactical complications that might arise from staying on the b5 square, particularly with the knight's current maneuverability. It also prepares for a potential kingside castling consolidation if the game were to continue in that vein, though the pawn structure suggests a more dynamic struggle is on the horizon. White is aiming for a solid, flexible setup, ready to react to black's next move without committing to a premature attack or defense. The knight's daring foray to d3 injects immediate uncertainty, seeking to exploit the slightly exposed white king and potentially disrupt the queen's bishop's influence on the a4-e8 diagonal. A bold attempt to activate the beleaguered rook and contest the open file, though it risks allowing the knight to penetrate further into white's territory. Unleashing the pawn storm on the kingside, a bold declaration of intent to rip open lines, though it simultaneously exposes your monarch to the incoming bishop fire. Recentralizing the knight here offers a more robust defense against black's pervasive queenside pressure, while simultaneously preparing to redeploy it to more active squares if the opportunity arises. Initiating a bold pawn thrust, black seeks to exploit the momentarily exposed f-file and create attacking chances, though it opens up new avenues for white's pieces to infiltrate. Initiating a redeployment of the knight, seeking a more active post on the kingside, aiming to support the pawn push and potentially create attacking chances. The pawn thrust is a desperate gamble to gain activity, but it leaves the king dangerously exposed to the advancing enemy pieces and opens crucial diagonals for white's attack. Reactivating the knight's patrol, this repositioning aims to shore up the kingside and potentially challenge black's encroaching pawns. The pawn chain's integrity shatters as this capture opens the f-file, creating an immediate avenue for aggressive pieces to infiltrate white's camp and potentially destabilize the monarch's sanctuary. The white king steps out of the shadows, a bold gambit to consolidate his position and prepare for a potential attack, but this also leaves him exposed to black's active pieces, particularly the menacing knight on d3 and the dangerous pawn on g2, which now controls crucial squares. Emerging from the queenside skirmish, the bishop now eyes the weakened kingside where white's monarch is exposed. This maneuver aims to exploit the open files and potentially create attacking opportunities against the castled king. Unleashing a knight to g3 injects immediate dynamism, threatening to exploit the exposed black king and potentially creating dangerous discovered attacks. Spotting that juicy check presents a crucial junction, potentially forcing the white king into an exposed position and disrupting any semblance of defensive harmony. Seeking to stabilize the exposed monarch after the immediate threat, embracing a defensive posture as the opponent's pieces converge on the kingside. Sacrificing the bishop here simplifies the position and opens the g-file, potentially giving black's rook more activity, but it also removes a key defender from the kingside. White will now need to be extremely careful about the unleashed attacking potential of black's remaining pieces against their exposed monarch. The X move, while seemingly recapturing material, plunges white into a precarious endgame with a significantly weakened kingside pawn structure. The isolated f-pawn will likely become a primary target for black's active pieces, and the open g-file created by the capture presents long-term attacking potential against the exposed white king. Sacrificing the bishop now is a bold attempt to dismantle white's pawn structure, aiming to create long-term weaknesses after recapturing with the pawn. The king's bold sortie to f3, a surprising detour, ventures into contested territory, seeking refuge and potential counterplay amidst the ensuing chaos. A calculated gamble to inject some life into a static position, hoping to unravel white's pawn structure before fully solidifying black's own defenses. Unveiling the king into the fray, a daring gambit to contest the center, while black's bishop on e5 stares ominously, poised to exploit any defensive lapse. Unleashing a powerful check, black immediately disrupts white's king's safety, forcing a retreat and potentially exposing critical squares around the monarch. This aggressive checking sequence is a clever attempt to exploit the king's central position and the lack of immediate defensive pieces for white, aiming to seize the initiative and create tactical opportunities in the ensuing play. Repositioning the rook to the fourth rank secures the critical open file and prepares to contest any potential queenside pawn advances from the opponent. Bringing the rook back to the b-file aims to reinforce the pressure on white's queenside pawns and potentially contest the open file, hinting at a desire to activate more pieces for the upcoming fight in the center. Unleashing a pawn storm, white decisively sacrifices material to create a devastating passed f-pawn, aiming to pierce black's king's defenses and disrupt its pieces. The black king, exposed by earlier tactical exchanges, now seeks refuge behind a nascent pawn shield, a desperate attempt to consolidate its position amidst white's active pieces and the open files. The king ventures into a tempest of pawns, seeking refuge on a square that, while seemingly safer for now, invites a dangerous pawn storm's advance, potentially opening critical lines of attack towards the monarch's new position. The rook's excursion to the seventh rank immediately challenges the pawn structure and seeks to disrupt white's defensive setup, aiming to exploit the potential weakness on the weakened light squares around the white king. The queens are gone, and now the race is on to activate your sidelined rook, aiming to reclaim the open file and bring pressure to bear on black's less developed pieces. The knight's daring leap to e2 injects a surprising tactical wrinkle, aiming to disrupt white's newly established pawn majority on the kingside and exploit the open files. Re-establishing the rook's presence on the open file immediately addresses the critical king safety issue. Suddenly, the knight boldly rides into the enemy camp, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially create immediate threats against the exposed monarch. The king cautiously retreats to a more defensible square, seeking sanctuary from the encroaching enemy knights and the open lines that threaten to unravel white's position. Unleashing a surprise pawn thrust, black aims to exploit the exposed white king and potentially create mating nets by driving the monarch further into the center. The monarch abandons the relative safety of the second rank, stepping into a more active, albeit exposed, role to pressure black's pieces and potentially aid the rook's advance. The king, exposed and alone, ventures into the heart of enemy territory, seeking refuge, but perhaps finding only greater peril amidst the scattered pieces.